think the moment passed quietly, but it didn't. Something shifted while you were still trusting the surface. There was a second when the room changed and you stayed the same, and that's the moment they counted on. They knew you would never notice, not because you were weak, but because you were honest. You assumed signals meant what they looked like, words meant what they said, silence meant nothing at all. That assumption was the opening. From there, everything became easier for them. They didn't need to lie loudly. They only needed to stop correcting the misunderstanding. Machiavelli understood this long before modern language softened it. He knew power rarely announces itself. It watches, waits, and lets others misread it. The world he described still works the same way. People don't betray you in a single act. They slowly remove clarity and let confusion do the work. You felt it as distance without explanation, warmth that cooled without reason, reactions that arrived half a second too late. You told yourself it was nothing. They noticed that too. Once someone realizes you doubt your own perception, the game changes. They begin to move freely while you stay stuck replaying details that no longer matter. They didn't fear your anger, they feared your awareness, because awareness ends leverage. That's why it was taken from you piece by piece. Machiavelli would never waste energy on confrontation when misdirection is cheaper. He knew that if you can keep someone unsure, you never need to control them directly. And control is always quieter when the other person thinks they still have it. You weren't excluded, you were positioned, close enough to be useful, distant enough to be denied. The moment you sensed something was wrong was the moment they smiled inwardly, because delay works in their favor. Confusion buys time, and time in the wrong hands becomes dominance. After that moment, nothing obvious happened, and that's what made it effective. No explosion, no clear rejection, no clean break, just a quiet shift in how you were treated. Answers became shorter, eye contact lasted a fraction less, interest arrived already diluted. You sensed the pattern but couldn't name it, and without a name, you couldn't defend against it. They relied on that. People who plan don't rush. They let you exhaust yourself searching for meaning that was removed on purpose. Machiavelli saw this clearly. He knew uncertainty weakens faster than force ever could. When you don't know where you stand nowhere. They gave you enough to stay engaged, never enough to feel secure. That balance wasn't accidental. You started adjusting yourself, your tone, your timing, your expectations, while they stayed perfectly still. That's the inversion most people miss. The one who adapts loses ground. The one who remains unchanged gains it. You thought patience was strength, but patience without clarity becomes permission. Every time you accepted a vague response, every time you explained away a cold gesture, you signaled that the threshold was lower than it should be. They learned exactly how little effort was required to keep you in place. Machiavelli would have recognized the pattern instantly. He understood that people reveal their boundaries not by what they say, but by what they tolerate in silence. Once that silence is mapped, manipulation becomes efficient. You weren't being tested anymore, you had already been measured. And when someone knows your limits better than you do, they don't need to push, they simply step around them. You felt the imbalance but framed it as misunderstanding because admitting intent would have forced a decision. And indecision is safer than loss, until it isn't. The longer this went on, the more the truth blended into the background, not erased, just quieted. That's how they wanted it. Because as long as you kept asking yourself what changed, they never had to answer. By the time you realized something was wrong, the damage was already normalized. That's the trick most people never see. Nothing dramatic had to happen because the goal was never impact, it was erosion. They didn't betray you loudly, they reduced you quietly. Invitations stopped arriving with urgency. Respect softened into convenience. Your presence became optional without being acknowledged. You weren't pushed out. You were left behind while still standing in the same place. That's why it took so long to notice. Your mind kept comparing today to yesterday, not to what should have been. Machiavelli understood this type of power well. He knew that removing certainty is more effective than removing loyalty. When people are confused, they police themselves. You replayed moments, searching for the exact second everything shifted, but there was no single moment. There was a gradual withdrawal disguised as normal life. And the most dangerous part is that they never had to lie to you. They simply stopped being fully present while allowing you to believe they still were. That illusion kept you cooperative. You kept showing up with the same energy while receiving less in return, and every imbalance teaches a lesson. Not to you, to them. They learned that you would stay even when the exchange became uneven. That knowledge is leverage. You mistook familiarity for connection and history for commitment. They didn't. They watched how you responded when effort declined. They watched how long you stayed silent. They watched how much you were willing to accept without naming it. That's when the hierarchy locked in. Not because they became stronger, but because you adapted downward. Machiavelli would never confuse endurance with power. He knew that the one who sets the frame decides the outcome. And while you were trying to preserve something you thought was mutual, they were already calculating how replaceable you had become. You weren't ignored because you were invisible. You were ignored because they knew you would still be there tomorrow. What most people never accept is that being useful is not the same as being valued. Use has a shelf life. Value creates protection. They didn't keep you close because they respected you. They kept you close because you were predictable. Predictability is comfort for those who want control without responsibility. You filled gaps, absorbed tension, stabilized moments that weren't yours to carry. And every time you did, the cost of losing you dropped. You became infrastructure, not a person. That's why when distance appeared, it felt illogical. You thought logic still applied. It didn't. Power dynamics rarely announce when they shift. They just move silently while you're busy being reasonable. Machiavelli understood something most people miss. When someone no longer fears your absence, your presence stops mattering. That's not cruelty, that's structure. You kept explaining yourself because you believed clarity would restore balance. But explanations don't raise status, they expose insecurity. Silence would have done more. Withdrawal would have done more. Instead, you stayed visible, available, emotionally legible. And that legibility made you easy to manage. They could read you, anticipate you, delay you without consequence. Notice how nothing ever escalated. No confrontation, no closure, no clean break. Just a slow fading where you were expected to understand without being told. That expectation itself was the reveal. It meant your understanding was no longer a priority. You were supposed to adjust quietly. Accept less without naming it. Smile through subtraction. Machiavelli would never negotiate from a shrinking position. He knew that when respect dissolves, affection follows it out the door. And still, you stayed longer than you should have, not because you were weak, but because you believed depth mattered more than leverage. They believed the opposite. That difference is where the outcome was decided. There's a moment most people never mark because it doesn't hurt loudly. It feels like confusion first, a delay, a shift in tone that can't be proven. That's when you were already out. Not removed, just replaced in function. Someone else started carrying what you used to provide: attention, validation, stability. Silence. You weren't competing because you didn't know there was a game, and that ignorance wasn't accidental. The people who benefit from you rarely clarify the rules. They let you play by fairness while they play by leverage. That's why it feels unfair in retrospect. It wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a symmetry. Machiavelli described this world clearly, even if people pretend it evolved. He knew that those who control perception don't need to control outcomes directly. They let others exhaust themselves trying to keep what was already gone. You felt the drain but named it loyalty. You felt the imbalance but called it patience. Meanwhile, your usefulness peaked and quietly declined. Once that happened, your emotions became noise. Your effort became background. And when you finally sensed the distance, it was already normalized for them. That's why they seemed calm when you were unraveling. They had time to detach. You didn't. Detachment favors the prepared. Power favors the one who leaves first internally. That's why the final moments feel so cold. No anger, no guilt, just absence where meaning used to be. Machiavelli would never chase clarity from someone who benefits from ambiguity. He understood that when people stop investing, they start observing. And observation without consequence is how you no longer matter. You weren't betrayed in one act. You were phased out. And the most dangerous part is this: if you don't recognize the pattern, you'll keep mistaking being needed for being chosen. By the time you finally see it, the damage isn't dramatic, it's complete. Nothing to confront, nothing to fix, because the decision was made long before you felt the loss. That's why realization feels heavier than rejection. Rejection at least acknowledges your presence. This didn't. You were useful, then invisible, and both states required your silence. Machiavelli understood this kind of disappearance. Not exile, not conflict, just quiet removal. The world he described still works the same because human nature never changed, only the excuses did. People don't cut you off when you fail them. They detach when you stop serving a function they can't replace faster. And when that happens, explanations vanish. You're left alone with awareness, and awareness is the real punishment. It forces you to replay moments that were never mutual. Loyalty that was never returned. Patience that only benefited one side. If this feels uncomfortable, it should. Discomfort means you're finally seeing the edges of the game. And if you're seeing it now, you're already ahead of the version of yourself who never questioned it. Let this sit with you. Let it sharpen how you observe, how you trust, how you give. And if this perspective resonates, stay close to it. Acknowledge it quietly. Share it with someone who needs to see what you just saw, and leave a mark so you don't forget this moment of clarity, because the next time you'll notice sooner.